Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into the shadow-soaked forests and fog-covered moors, where Europe's most terrifying legends were born. Not from imagination, but from real events that entire communities witnessed and recorded in chilling detail. Before we begin, hit like if you're ready to uncover the truth behind humanity's oldest nightmares, and let me know in the comments which ancient fear still keeps you awake at night. Now dim those lights and settle in. We're about to explore how Europe's darkest corners gave birth to creatures so terrifying that their names alone could empty entire villages. Now, without further ado, let's begin. The snow falls like ash over the village of Karos, and beneath it, something stirs that should not stir. The winter of 1316 has stretched its fingers deep into spring, and the grain stores that should have lasted until harvest lie empty as coffins. In the house at the village's edge, Margit presses her ear to the cellar door and listens to her husband scraping at stones, searching for roots that rotted away months ago. She knows what comes next. They all know. The hunger has been patient, this thing that gnaws from within. It began as an ache, familiar as morning frost. Then it grew teeth. Now it whispers in the spaces between heartbeats, in the hollow places where hope used to live. It speaks in her dead children's voices, tells her stories of meat that walks on two legs, of flesh that could fill the terrible emptiness. Below in the cellar, the scraping stops. The little ice age has settled over Europe like a burial shroud. From the Baltic to the Alps, the earth refuses its ancient bargain. Crops wither in soil that should be black with life. Rivers freeze so deep that fish become legends. And in the spaces between survival and surrender, something new takes shape. Something with the face of a man and the hunger of winter itself. They will call it Wendigo in the forests of the north, though that name carries ocean wind and pine song from lands beyond the grey Atlantic. Here, in the heart of Europe's dying, it wears older faces. Nachtsera, the death feeder that consumes its own shroud before rising to devour the living. Blutsaga, the blood drinker born in the moment when human becomes something else entirely. The archaeologists will find them centuries later, the bones of the great famine buried in pits like broken pottery, skulls cracked open for marrow, rib cages scraped clean with stone and iron, children's bones that tell stories no mother should have to hear. In the soil of Northern Europe, the evidence waits. We ate each other, and in eating, we became the first monsters. But the bones cannot speak the deeper truth. They cannot tell you about the moment when Anna of Bremen looked at her sister's sleeping form and felt her mouth water. Cannot describe the sound Wilhelm the miller made when he realized the grinding in his mill wasn't grain anymore. Cannot capture the expression in Father Joachim's eyes when he blessed meat that had no name, knowing God had turned his face away long ago. The hunger changes a person from the inside out. First the body, skin drawing tight over jutting bones, eyes sinking deep into skulls like stones thrown into dark water. Then the mind, thoughts circling endlessly around a single, consuming need. Finally, the soul, that innermost part that makes human human, begins to fray like rope in a storm. This is how monsters are born, not in forests dark and deep, but in the warm places where families gather. Not from curses spoken by witches, but from the simple, terrible mathematics of winter. Too many mouths, too little food, and the moment when love becomes appetite. In the folklore that survives, the Wendigo appears as a giant, gaunt as winter trees, with yellowed fangs and eyes like holes burned through parchment. But this is how horror hides itself in stories, makes itself large and distant and other. The truth is smaller and closer and infinitely more terrible. The Wendigo looks exactly like us. It walks into the longhouse on legs that remember dancing. It speaks with a voice that once sang lullabies. It reaches for the baby with hands that know the shape of blessing. And in the moment before those hands become claws, there is still something human looking out through those holes where eyes used to be. Something that remembers what it was before the hunger made it into what it is. The northern forests echo with warnings passed down in whispers. Never travel alone in the starving months. Never trust the stranger who appears when food runs low. Never, never speak of meat when there is no meat to be found, because speaking makes it real, and reality has teeth. But Europe's Wendigo wears different masks in different lands. In the Germanic forests, they tell of the Nachtseher, the corpse that rises from its grave still wrapped in burial cloth, consuming its own shroud thread by thread before emerging to drain the life from sleeping families. The cloth disappears into a mouth that can never be filled, and when the shroud is gone, the creature turns its attention to fresher meat. They bury their dead with stones in their mouths now, these villagers who have learned the cost of hunger that outlasts death. Iron nails driven through skulls, heavy rocks placed on graves to keep the earth from heaving upward. Because once the hunger gets into your bones, death becomes just another door to walk through. Further east, where the Slavic winds carry the scent of snow and old blood, the Blutsauger stalks through folk tales like a fever dream, part vampire, part revenant, part living embodiment of starvation itself. A creature that feeds on blood because blood is the only food that still carries the memory of warmth. The stories cluster around the same terrible seasons. 1315, when the rains came and never stopped, rotting seed in the ground and hope in the heart. 1317, when children's graves outnumbered the living in villages from Scotland to Hungary. 1322, when the survivors emerged from their holes like ghosts, carrying stories that would birth nightmares for centuries. In these years of the Great Famine, something fundamental shifted in the European mind. Hunger stopped being temporary and became eternal, not just a condition of the body, but a state of the soul. And in that shift, the first monsters found their footing. Not supernatural beings from some distant other world, but reflections of what humans become when the world stops providing and the hunger never stops growing. The transformation follows a pattern, repeated in story after story across the frozen continent. First comes denial. This cannot be happening, God would not allow it. Surely spring will come early this year. Then comes desperate hope. Perhaps the root sellers of the next village. Perhaps the charity of distant lords. Perhaps a miracle. When hope dies, calculation begins. Who can be spared? Who serves no purpose? Who would be missed least if they simply disappeared? The mind, that magnificent instrument of human reason, turns itself to problems it was never meant to solve. And when calculation gives way to action, when the first bite is taken and the first boundary crossed, that is when the human becomes something else. Not instantly. Transformation is a gradual thing, like frost creeping across a window pane, but inevitably. Because once you have tasted that forbidden meat, once you have felt the hunger quiet for even a moment, you learn a truth that changes everything. The hunger can be fed. This is the birth of Europe's first moral monsters, creatures defined not by their supernatural powers, but by their willingness to cross lines that should never be crossed. They are warnings made flesh, cautionary tales that walk among us. They whisper that civilization is thinner than we pretend, that the difference between human and beast is measured in missed meals. The Wendigo, in all its European forms, serves as guardian at the gate between necessity and atrocity. It stands at the place where survival meets soul death and asks the eternal question, what would you do to live another day? What would you sacrifice? What would you become? In the warm seasons when food is plenty and bellies are full, these monsters retreat to the edges of memory. They become folk tales told to frighten children, superstitions dismissed by learned men. But they never truly disappear. They wait in the spaces between harvests, in the thin months when winter shows its teeth. Because they are not really monsters at all. They are us, stripped of everything that makes us comfortable with our own reflection. They are the shadow that every human casts when the light grows dim and the choices grow hard. They are hunger given teeth and purpose, need transformed into something that stalks the night, searching for sustenance that can never be found. The snow still falls like ash over the village of Kuros. In the house at the village's edge, Margit no longer presses her ear to the cellar door. The scraping has stopped, and she knows why. Below, among the empty grain sacks and broken pottery, something new has been born. Something that wears her husband's face, but speaks in Winter's voice. She bars the door with shaking hands and whispers prayers to a god who seems to have forgotten the taste of mercy. Outside, the wind carries a sound like laughter, hungry and patient and terribly, terribly human. The hunger has found its shape at last. It walks on 2 legs now, and it knows her name. As the hunger fades, a different darkness rises. The men come home from Agincourt, walking like ghosts, their eyes holding depths that no mortal gaze should plumb. They have seen the flower of French knighthood trampled into mud beneath English boots. They have heard the wet sound of arrows finding flesh, the bubbling prayers of dying boys calling for mothers who will never answer. They carry the taste of blood in their mouths, and the weight of what they have done pressed into their souls like brands. In the village of Bedburg, Peter Stubber watches his reflection in the still water of the well and does not recognize what looks back. The face is his, the same weathered cheeks, the same greying beard. But something behind the eyes has changed. Something that learned new hungers in the forests of France. New appetites that have nothing to do with food. The beast lives in him now. He can feel it moving beneath his skin like a fever, stretching and testing the boundaries of his human flesh. At night, when the moon bleeds silver through his shutters, it whispers promises of transformation, of freedom from the weight of memory and guilt. It tells him stories of running on 4 legs through darkness, of hunting prey that screams and struggles, and finally falls silent. War births monsters differently than famine does. Hunger creates creatures that consume. Werewolves become something else entirely. They are metamorphosis made manifest, the external expression of an internal transformation that began the moment a man first drove steel into another man's belly and felt something inside himself howl with pleasure. The 100 Years' War has painted Europe crimson for generations. Fathers teach sons the art of killing, and sons improve upon their fathers' techniques. Entire bloodlines become skilled in the crafting of death, their names whispered in the same breath as plague and famine. And with each passing season, each new campaign, the beast grows stronger in the hearts of those who survive. They return to villages that remember them as boys who helped with harvest, as young men who courted bakers' daughters and sang in church choirs. But something essential has been carved out of them and replaced with winter wind. Their wives lie beside strangers who wear familiar faces. Their children flinch from embraces that smell of iron and foreign earth. This is how the werewolf is truly born, not from a bite or a curse, but from the slow alchemy of violence that transforms human souls into something that can only find peace in the shape of a beast. The transformation follows patterns that village-wise women recognize, but dare not name. First comes the restlessness, men who cannot sit still, who pace their homes like caged animals, who start at sounds that no one else can hear. Then the hunger for meat, always meat, preferably torn fresh and bloody from the bone. Finally, the rage that builds behind their eyes like storm clouds, dark and promising terrible weather. Peter Stubber knows these signs because he has lived them. The werewolf of Bedburg. They will call him in the years to come, when his name becomes synonymous with transformation and terror. But in this moment, in 1589, he is simply a man trying to hold together a mind that war has shattered into pieces sharp enough to cut. The beast wants out. It claws at the inside of his skull with talons that feel more real than his own fingernails. It whispers that his human shape is a prison, that flesh and bone are chains that can be broken if he simply lets go of his grip on what he thinks he is. It promises that the wolf shape will bring peace, will quiet the screaming that never stops echoing in the spaces between his thoughts. Across the German forests, in the bitter aftermath of the 30 Years' War, similar transformations unfold like dark flowers blooming in poisoned soil. Soldiers who have spent decades learning the geometry of death find themselves unable to remember the mathematics of peace. They sit in taverns and stare at their hands. These instruments that have become so skilled at ending lives that they no longer remember how to create anything. The war has lasted so long that entire generations have known nothing else. Children born in the first year of fighting are now warriors themselves, raised on stories of burning cities and mass graves. They carry violence in their blood, like a hereditary curse, and when they finally lay down their weapons, the violence has nowhere to go but inward. In Livonia, where the werewolf trials of 1692 will tear apart entire communities, the old man Thies tells stories that make the church fathers cross themselves and reach for iron. He speaks of running with wolf packs through the forest, of hunting demons and witches in the shape of a beast. He claims this lycanthropy as a gift, a tool for fighting the darkness that ordinary men cannot touch. But the tremor in his voice tells a different story. It speaks of nights when the human mind shuts down to protect itself from what the wolf body has done. It whispers of waking in forest clearings with blood under his fingernails and memories that feel like someone else's fever dreams. It hints at the terrible relief of becoming something that cannot be held responsible for human choices. The medical men of the age document these transformations with the cold precision of natural philosophers studying botanical specimens. They write of lycanthropy as a form of melancholia, a corruption of the humours that causes men to believe themselves transformed. They prescribe bloodletting and purges, herbs and prayers, as if madness were simply another sickness that could be purged from the body. They do not understand that lycanthropy is not a disease, but a solution. The mind's desperate attempt to make sense of what happens when human beings are asked to do inhuman things for inhuman lengths of time. The wolf shape is not delusion, but translation. The soul's attempt to find a form that can carry the weight of what has been done without breaking entirely. The transformation ritual varies from place to place, but the essence remains constant. A salve made from the fat of murdered children, according to Peter Stubber's confession, though that confession comes only after the torturer's wheels have done their work, when truth and fiction have been ground together like grain in a bloody mill. Belts made from wolf hide that grant the power of change, pacts with devils who offer escape from human limitations in exchange for human souls. But the real transformation requires no ritual, no supernatural intervention. It happens in the moment when a man realizes that he has become more comfortable with killing than with living, more at home in the forest than in his own bed, more himself when wearing the mask of a beast than when looking in a mirror with his human face. The ergot grows in the rye fields like a black blessing, a fungal gift that transforms ordinary grain into something that can unlock doors in the mind that were meant to stay closed. The soldiers eat bread made from infected grain and feel reality soften around the edges. Colours become more vivid. Sounds take on texture and weight. And deep in the limbic brain, ancient pathways light up like torches. Pathways that remember when humans were prey and predators both. Under ergot's influence, the line between human and animal consciousness dissolves like salt in water. Men report seeing their own hands sprout claws, feeling their faces elongate into snouts, sensing the world through a wolf's keen nose instead of human eyes. They describe the intoxicating freedom of running on 4 legs, of thinking with a predator's simple clarity, of existing without the burden of moral choice. The church calls this demonic possession and prescribes exorcism. The physicians call it temporary madness and recommend confinement. Neither understands that for men whose human lives have become unbearable, temporary madness feels like the closest thing to salvation they are likely to find. In the forests surrounding Bedburg, Peter Stube learns to navigate this transformation with the skill of a craftsman perfecting his trade. He discovers that the change comes easier when the moon is dark, when the familiar world retreats into shadow and leaves room for older realities to emerge. He finds that certain words, certain movements, can ease the transition from human to wolf and back again. But mostly he learns that the wolf shape is hungry for things that human flesh cannot digest. It feeds on fear and pain, on the moment when prey realizes it has become prey. It draws sustenance from the struggle, from the desperate attempts at escape that only make the hunt more satisfying. And when the feeding is done, when the wolf retreats back into human flesh, Peter finds that some essential part of himself has been consumed as well. The transformation is never complete. There are always fragments of humanity left behind in the wolf shape, just as there are always traces of the beast remaining in human form. This is what makes the werewolf truly monstrous. Not the claws or fangs or predatory strength, but the consciousness that experiences both states and remembers the pleasure each one brings. They will catch Peter Stubber eventually. They will stretch him on the wheel and break his bones until he confesses to crimes that may be true, or may be the only words that can stop the pain. They will execute him with the ritual precision that the age reserves for monsters, as if his death could somehow undo the transformation that war has worked on an entire generation. But the wolf shape has already spread beyond one man's flesh. It lives now in the spaces between human and animal, between civilization and wilderness, between the shape we show the world and the shape we become when we think no one is watching. It stalks through the European night on legs that know the paths between villages, seeking prey that walks upright and bleeds red and makes sounds that almost sound like words. In the Livonian forests, where werewolf trials will soon consume entire communities in flames of suspicion and confession, the old stories take on new weight. Grandmothers who once told tales of shapeshifters to frighten children from the woods now look at their own sons and grandsons and wonder what shapes they wear when darkness falls. The beast within has found its home in the human heart, and it is content to wait. War taught it patience along with hunger. It knows that there will always be another conflict, another generation of young men who need to learn the taste of violence. It knows that the wolf shape is always there, ready to offer refuge to minds that can no longer bear the weight of what they have done in human form. The men come home from war carrying this darkness like a wound that will not heal. They bring it to their wives' beds and their children's cradles. They carry it to the fields and the market squares, to the churches where they kneel and pretend that prayer can wash the blood from their memories. And when the moon rises full and bright, when the familiar world retreats into silver shadow, the beast stretches within their human flesh and reminds them that transformation is always possible. That there is a shape they can wear that feels no guilt, knows no regret, remembers only the pure and simple pleasure of the hunt. The wolf waits within them all, patient as winter, hungry as war itself. When the beast retreats, the shadows come calling. Sleep, that merciful darkness that should bring respite from the waking world's horrors, becomes a hunting ground for things that have no names in daylight languages. In the hour between midnight and dawn, when the boundary between conscious and unconscious grows thin as parchment, the monsters that hunger and war have birthed find new ways to feed. Margit of Augsburg wakes to the weight of invisible hands pressing down on her chest, pinning her to the straw mattress like a butterfly to a board. Her eyes open to darkness so complete it seems solid, yet somehow she can see the thing that crouches on her ribs, a shape that shifts between shadow and substance. Its face a mockery of human features, twisted into an expression of endless hunger. She tries to scream, but no sound comes. Tries to move, but her body has become stone. The creature leans closer, and she smells the grave earth on its breath. feels the cold that radiates from its flesh like winter fog. It whispers her name in a voice that sounds like wind through empty houses, tells her secrets about the darkness that lives in human hearts. This is the Alp, the night demon of Germanic tradition, and it has come to feast on more than flesh. It feeds on fear and helplessness, on the terrible vulnerability of sleep-paralyzed minds. It sustains itself on the moment when the rational world dissolves and leaves only primal terror behind. In the village of Saint-Denis, where the abbey bells no longer ring at matins because too many monks have reported strange visitations in the pre-dawn hours, Brother Francois lies rigid in his narrow cell and feels the cauchemar settle onto his chest like a living nightmare. The French dream hag comes wearing the face of every sin he has tried to forget, every moment of weakness that has stained his soul. She is beautiful and terrible. This creature that the common folk call mare, the root of nightmare itself. Her hair flows like black water, and her eyes hold depths that reflect not light but shadow. She presses her mouth to his and breathes out all the darkness he has swallowed in his waking hours, all the doubts and hungers and secret shames that he carries like stones in his chest. The paralysis is complete. His body has become a prison, and she holds all the keys. She whispers that this is what he deserves, that this helplessness is simply the truth of his condition made manifest, that all humans are prey in the end, all victims waiting for something with teeth to find them. Sleep, that most basic human need, has become a doorway to hell. The phenomenon follows patterns that healers recognize, but struggle to understand. It comes most often to those who carry heavy burdens: the grieving widow, the guilt-ridden soldier, the mother who has lost too many children to count. It visits in the hours when the mind should find peace, turning rest into torment and dreams into hunting grounds. Medieval physicians, working with humours and bloodletting, diagnose melancholia, an excess of black bile that corrupts the natural balance and allows demons to take hold. They prescribe bitter herbs and bleeding, fasting and prayer, as if the darkness could be purged from the body like any other poison. But the wise women who tend to birth and death, who see the patterns that learned men miss, know better. They understand that these night visitations are not invasions from outside, but eruptions from within, the mind's attempt to process traumas too large for conscious thought to contain. The monsters that come in sleep wear faces tailored to individual terrors. For the merchant who has grown rich while his neighbours starve, the Alp appears as a skeletal child demanding bread. For the priest who has broken his vows, the mare takes the form of temptation made flesh. For the soldier who has seen too much death, the night hag comes wearing the faces of every man he has killed. They are psychological scavengers, these sleep demons, feeding on the psychic waste that accumulates in minds unable to process the full weight of their experiences. They transform guilt into visitation, shame into supernatural encounter, grief into something that crouches on the chest and whispers poison into sleeping ears. In the Irish countryside, where the Doulahan rides headless through the night and banshees keen for the dying, they know the night hag by older names. She is the Bean Seeder's sister, the dark twin of prophecy who comes not to warn but to torment. She settles on the chests of those who have lost their way, who carry burdens too heavy for human backs to bear. Old Bridget McGowan, whose son died at Flodden Field and whose husband followed him to the grave from grief, knows the weight of the hag's visitation intimately. Night after night, she wakes to find herself trapped in her own body, while something that wears her dead son's face tells her all the ways she failed him. It recites every harsh word, every moment of impatience, every time she chose exhaustion over tenderness. The paralysis is both physical and spiritual, a complete helplessness that strips away every defense and leaves only raw vulnerability behind. The night hag feeds on this exposure, drawing sustenance from the moment when all pretense falls away and reveals the wounded animal that lives at the core of every human soul. In the German principalities, where the 30 Years' War has left entire regions populated more by ghosts than by living men, the Alp has grown fat on the terror of survivors. It comes to those who have seen their villages burn, their families slaughtered, their world reduced to ash and bone. It feeds on the survivors' guilt that gnaws at them like hunger, the terrible knowledge that they lived while others died, that chance and circumstance saved them from fates they may have deserved. The creature's method is always the same. It waits for the moment between waking and sleeping, when consciousness relaxes its grip and allows older parts of the brain to surface. Then it strikes with the precision of a surgeon, paralyzing the body while leaving the mind horribly aware. It creates a state where the victim becomes spectator to their own helplessness, forced to witness, but unable to act. Protection rituals evolve like antibodies, passed from generation to generation in whispered instructions. Iron under the pillow, because the old spirits fear the touch of worked metal. Salt circles around the bed, because salt preserves and purifies and creates barriers that demons cannot cross. Prayer beads clutched in sleeping hands, because holy words have power even when consciousness has fled. But the most effective protection is often the simplest. A companion's presence, another human heartbeat in the darkness, to anchor the mind to waking reality. The monsters of sleep hunt solitary prey, feeding on isolation and abandonment. They flee from connection, from the reminder that humans are not meant to face the darkness alone. In the monasteries where monks sleep in individual cells, reports of visitation multiply like plague. Brother after brother awakens paralyzed and terrorized, describing creatures that seem to know their most shameful secrets, that whisper about sins they thought were hidden from all eyes but God's. The Alp comes wearing the faces of women they knew before taking vows, reminding them of desires that should have died with their old lives. The Church Fathers prescribe extended fasting, believing that bodily mortification will drive out the demons that feast on flesh. They do not understand that the demons are already inside, born from the impossible task of denying human nature in service to divine command. The Alp feeds not on the body, but on the gap between what men are and what they pretend to be. In the French countryside, where the cauchemar rides the night winds like a plague, they bury horseshoes in the corners of bedchambers and hang bundles of vervain from the ceiling beams. Old Marie Dubois, who has delivered half the babies in the region and prepared the other half for their graves, knows the traditional protections by heart. She whispers them to young mothers whose infants will not sleep, to soldiers' wives who wake screaming in the pre-dawn hours, to anyone who carries the weight of unprocessed grief. Iron and salt, holy water and herb bundles, but most importantly, the knowledge that they are not alone in their suffering, that the night terrors that visit them have stalked human sleep since the first human closed their eyes and dreamed of monsters. The paralysis serves a purpose beyond simple torment. It creates a state where the normal defenses of consciousness collapse, where the careful barriers between acceptable and unacceptable thoughts dissolve like sugar in rain. In this vulnerable state, the mind can finally confront truths too terrible for daylight examination. The night hag whispers about the moment when the mother wished her crying infant would simply stop breathing. The Alp speaks of the priest's dreams about breaking his vows with eager hands and hungry mouth. The cauchemar tells the soldier about the part of him that enjoyed the killing, that found pleasure in the moment when steel met flesh, and another human life flickered out like a snuffed candle. These are not external demons, but internal truths given form and substance. They are the shadow selves that every human carries, the parts of personality that civilized society demands be hidden, but which never truly disappear. Sleep paralysis becomes the stage where these shadows can finally speak their names. where the full complexity of human nature reveals itself in all its terrible beauty. The phenomenon spreads through communities like contagion, one terrified report inspiring others, until entire villages echo with stories of night visitation. The fear becomes self-perpetuating. The more people expect to encounter demons in their sleep, the more likely they become to experience exactly that. Expectation shapes experience, and experience reinforces expectation, until the boundary between objective reality and collective nightmare becomes impossible to distinguish. In the Saxon territories, where memories of pagan gods still lurk beneath Christian ceremony like wolves beneath sheep's clothing, the Alp appears wearing the faces of older terrors. Sometimes it comes as Woden the Wild Hunter, demanding tribute from those who have forgotten the old ways. Sometimes it manifests as the mare herself, the primordial night spirit from which all lesser demons spring. These ancient visitations carry different messages, not just personal guilt and shame, but cultural trauma, the psychic wound of a people severed from their ancestral understanding of the world. The Alp speaks to Saxon farmers in the language of forgotten gods, reminding them of rituals abandoned and spirits offended, of a time when humans knew their place in a living cosmos instead of pretending mastery over a dead one. The protective rituals grow more elaborate as the visitations intensify. Entire households develop intricate bedtime ceremonies, specific prayers to be spoken, particular arrangements of blessed objects, careful positioning of iron and salt and holy water. These rituals serve multiple purposes. They provide a sense of agency in the face of helplessness, create community bonds through shared practice, and most importantly, establish a clear transition between the waking world of human control and the sleeping world of mystery and terror. In Prague, where Rabbi Judah Loew tends to his flock beneath the shadow of the castle, the night demons take on distinctly Jewish characteristics. The Alp appears to worried fathers as the ghosts of pogroms past and future, whispering about blood libels and burning synagogues. It feeds on the particular terror of a people who know that survival depends on vigilance, that safety is always temporary, and persecution always possible. The rabbi teaches protective prayers in Hebrew and Aramaic, words that carry the weight of thousands of years of human struggle against darkness, both literal and metaphorical. But even sacred language cannot always hold back the tide of night terror, cannot always prevent the mind from conjuring horrors that feel more real than reality itself. As dawn breaks over the sleeping villages of Europe, the night demons retreat to whatever spaces they inhabit during the hours of light. The paralysis lifts, movement returns, and the victims of nocturnal visitation rise from their beds to face another day of pretending that the horrors of darkness have no claim on the waking world. But the memory lingers like a taste that cannot be washed away. The knowledge that sleep itself has become a battlefield, that rest offers no respite from the monsters that human experience creates, the understanding that the darkness outside pales in comparison to the darkness within, and that the most terrible demons are often the ones that wear our own faces and speak in our own voices. The night hag settles into her daytime hiding places, patient as a spider in her web. She knows that evening will come again, that humans must sleep whether they wish to or not. She knows that the traumas that birth her will never fully heal, that guilt and shame and grief are renewable resources that regenerate with each passing generation. In the space between sleeping and waking, where consciousness loosens its grip and older truths emerge, she waits, ready to remind each dreamer that the monsters they fear most are not external threats but internal realities, the parts of themselves they dare not acknowledge, the shadows that dance at the edges of every human soul. As the shadows of sleep retreat, a different darkness spreads across the land, like spilled ink on parchment. Death comes walking through Europe with patient feet, and in its wake, the dead refuse to stay buried. The plague arrives in Kaffa on merchant ships heavy with silk and spices, but its true cargo is invisible. Tiny passengers that leap from rat to flea to human flesh with the efficiency of seasoned travelers. By the time the ships reach Genoa, half the crew lies rotting in the hold, and the other half wishes they were dead. They bring more than disease to the Italian ports. They bring a new kind of monster, one that feeds not on flesh or fear, but on the very essence of life itself. In the village of Kisilova, in the Serbian countryside where the Danube winds like a silver serpent through the darkness, they bury Petar Blagojevic on a Tuesday morning in 1725. The priest speaks the proper words. The earth falls with its familiar hollow sound, and the mourners return to their homes believing that death has claimed another victory in its endless war against the living. They are wrong. Within a week, Petar's neighbors begin to die. Not from the violent plague that swept through decades earlier, but from something more insidious. They waste away in their beds, growing pale and weak, as if something essential were being drained from their bodies drop by drop. In their fevered dreams, they speak of Petar coming to visit them in the night, looking exactly as he did in life except for the eyes. Eyes that hold depths no living gaze should contain. The deaths follow a pattern that terrifies the village elders more than any battlefield carnage ever could. Each victim reports the same visitation. Petar appearing at their bedside in the hours before dawn, pressing his mouth to their throat, drawing out their life with a hunger that death should have ended. They describe the terrible intimacy of it, the way his cold flesh warms against theirs, the sound he makes as he feeds, part satisfaction, part desperate need, like a starving man finally offered bread. This is how the vampire enters European consciousness. Not as a supernatural aristocrat in a castle, but as a neighbor who refuses to acknowledge that dying means staying dead. Petar Blagojevic becomes something new, a creature that exists in the space between life and death, feeding on the living to sustain an existence that should have ended with his burial. The plague has taught Europe a terrible lesson. Death is not always final. Disease spreads from body to body with invisible fingers, turning healthy communities into charnel houses in the span of seasons. And in the aftermath of such devastation, when mass graves hold more residents than living villages, the boundary between dead and alive begins to blur like watercolors in rain. In Romania, where the Carpathian Mountains hold their secrets close as lovers, they know the creatures that rise from plague graves by older names. Strigoi, the restless dead who cannot find peace because they died carrying too much unfinished business, too much desperate attachment to the world of the living. These are not the elegant predators of later stories, but desperate things that claw their way up through consecrated soil, because the alternative, true death, has become unthinkable. The transformation follows disease like shadow follows light. First comes the plague itself, sweeping through communities with the thoroughness of wildfire, leaving behind landscapes of the dead that overwhelm every traditional ritual of burial and mourning. Bodies pile in hastily dug pits, thrown together without ceremony or individual grave sites. The proper rites that should ease the transition from life to death are abandoned in favor of simple survival. And in that abandonment, something goes wrong. The dead, improperly buried and improperly mourned, find themselves unable to rest. They retain just enough awareness to know they should not be aware, just enough desire to hunger for what they have lost. They become parasites of life itself, feeding on the vitality of the living to sustain their impossible existence. Maria Toma of Wallachia knows the weight of such visitation intimately. Her husband Constantin died in the cholera outbreak of 1831, buried hastily in the mass grave outside the village with dozens of others. But death, it seems, could not hold him. Night after night, he returns to their marriage bed, cold flesh pressed against her warm skin, drawing sustenance from her breath and blood and vital essence. She grows weaker with each visitation, her skin taking on the translucent quality of old parchment, her eyes sinking deep into their sockets like stones thrown into dark water. The village women whisper that she looks like someone who is dying from the inside out, consumed by something that should no longer have the power to consume. The symptoms of vampiric visitation mirror those of wasting diseases: tuberculosis, anemia, the slow consumption that eats away at life force more gradually than plague, but just as surely. Victims grow pale and listless, lose weight despite eating, develop a persistent cough that brings up blood dark as old wine. They complain of nightmares where the dead come calling, dreams so vivid they leave bite marks on the throat, and memories that feel more real than waking experience. Medical men struggle to understand the phenomenon through the lens of humours and miasma, attributing the sickness to corrupted air rising from improperly sealed graves. They prescribe the usual remedies: bloodletting and purges, herbs and poultices, but nothing seems to address the core problem. The dead refuse to behave like the dead should. In the German territories, where memories of the Black Death still haunt village squares and empty houses, the Nachtseher stirs in graves throughout the countryside. This creature differs from its Slavic cousins in one crucial detail. It begins its unholy feeding by consuming its own burial shroud, thread by thread, until nothing remains but naked corpse and endless hunger. The Nachtseher's method speaks to a different kind of desperation. While the vampire seeks external victims, this creature first devours its own grave goods, its own material connections to the world of the living. It consumes the cloth that should have wrapped it for eternity, as if trying to eat its way back to life from within the confines of death itself. Witnesses describe the sound that emerges from Nachtseher graves, a wet, rhythmic chewing that can be heard by those brave or foolish enough to press their ears to the disturbed earth. The creature works methodically through its shroud, each bite bringing it closer to the moment when it will have nothing left to consume but the flesh of the living. The plague years create perfect conditions for such creatures to flourish. Mass death overwhelms traditional burial practices, leaving bodies improperly consecrated and graves inadequately sealed. The sheer volume of corpses makes individual attention impossible. Priests speak hasty benedictions over dozens of bodies at once. Gravediggers work around the clock to stay ahead of the death toll, and the careful rituals that should ensure peaceful rest are abandoned in favor of expedience. In these hastily prepared graves, something essential goes wrong with the process of dying. The dead retain just enough connection to life to resist the pull of true oblivion. They become trapped in a state between states, neither fully alive nor properly dead, sustained by an endless hunger for what they have lost. The archaeological record bears witness to the terror these creatures inspired. Across Eastern Europe, excavations reveal skeletons pinned to their coffins with iron stakes, skulls weighted down with heavy stones, rib cages filled with garlic and holy symbols. These are not the careful burials of honored dead, but the desperate precautions of the living, trying to ensure that death remains final. In the Serbian village of Medveja, where Petar Blagojevic's story originates, the villagers take matters into their own hands. They dig up his grave barely a week after burial and find what they most fear to find: a corpse that shows no signs of decay, skin still pink with the bloom of life, fresh blood pooling around the mouth like evidence of recent feeding. The sight fills them with a terror deeper than any plague ever could. Death should be recognizable. Grey skin, sunken features, the unmistakable emptiness that signals the soul's departure. But Petar looks exactly as he did in life, except for a fullness around the mouth and throat that suggests he has been feeding well in his grave. They drive a wooden stake through his heart with the efficiency of farmers harvesting grain. Fresh blood wells up around the wooden point like a spring uncapped, more blood than any dead man should contain. The corpse makes a sound, not quite a scream, not quite a sigh, as if something essential were escaping along with the blood. The villagers burn the body immediately, not trusting burial to hold what burial has already failed to contain. They scatter the ashes in running water and speak prayers in languages older than Christianity, calling on protections that predate the plague by centuries. And for a time, the dying stops. The visitations end. Death remembers how to be final again. But the knowledge remains, spreading from village to village like disease itself. The understanding that plague creates more than corpses. It creates conditions where the dead can refuse to stay dead, where the boundary between life and death becomes permeable as cloth, where the desperate hunger of those who die before they are ready to die can sustain impossible existences in the space between worlds. In the hills above Prague, where Rabbi Judah Loew tends his flock beneath the watching stones of the old cemetery, similar stories circulate in whispered Hebrew and Yiddish. The Jewish dead, buried according to ancient law in proper shrouds and careful ceremonies, should rest peacefully in consecrated ground. But even the most meticulous rituals cannot always contain the desperation of those who die with too much unfinished business, too much love for life to accept its ending. The vampire evolves from these desperate circumstances into something more systematic, more purposeful. No longer just a confused corpse clinging to existence, it becomes a deliberate predator that has learned to sustain its impossible life through careful hunting. It develops the patience of a spider, the cunning of a wolf, the intimate knowledge of human vulnerability that comes from having once been human itself. These creatures understand their victims in ways that living predators never could. They know the weight of grief, the ache of loss, the desperate human need for connection that makes people vulnerable to visitation. They appear to the lonely and the guilty, to those who carry secret shames and hidden desires. They offer the terrible comfort of being known completely, understood absolutely, desired unconditionally, even if that desire is hunger, and that understanding is predatory. The intimacy of vampiric feeding becomes part of its horror. Unlike the distant, impersonal devastation of plague, vampirism creates a relationship between predator and prey. The creature whispers secrets in its victim's ear, shares memories of life and death, creates a bond that feels almost like love, even as it drains away everything that makes love possible. Across the Balkans, where vampires multiply like plague itself, entire communities develop elaborate protective rituals. Garlic hung in windows and doorways, not because its smell repels vampires, but because its life-giving properties create barriers that the undead cannot cross. Crucifixes and holy water, symbols of a power greater than death, wielded against creatures that represent death's refusal to accept its proper boundaries. Iron nails driven through coffin lids, because worked metal carries the essence of human creation, and vampires are fundamentally creatures of uncreation. Poppy seeds scattered on grave sites because vampires suffer from a compulsion to count and will waste precious darkness numbering seeds until dawn forces them back to their graves. These protections work not because they are magical, but because they represent human refusal to accept the vampire's terms of existence. They are declarations that death should remain final, that the living have rights that the dead must respect, that love and memory and grief should not become tools for predation. In the town of Valjevo, where the Kolubara River runs clear and cold through the Serbian heartland, they tell of Ana Bajic, who died in childbirth during the cholera summer of 1832. She should have rested peacefully beside her stillborn son, but love and desperation proved stronger than death's chains. Night after night, she returns to her family's house, seeking the breast milk that should have nourished her child, drawing sustenance from the life she never had the chance to give. Her husband wakes to find her bending over their surviving children, her cold mouth pressed to sleeping throats, taking what she needs to continue existing in the space between mother and monster. The children grow pale and listless, but they speak of beautiful dreams where their dead mother sings lullabies and tells stories of the place where the dead wait for the living to join them. This is perhaps the most terrible aspect of the vampire's nature, its ability to transform love into predation, care into consumption, the most sacred human bonds into feeding relationships. Anna loves her family with the desperate intensity of the dead, but that love has become a hunger that can only be satisfied by draining away their life force drop by drop. The plague creates perfect conditions for such transformations. Mass death overwhelms the careful rituals that should ensure peaceful transition from life to afterlife. Bodies are buried hastily, without proper ceremony, in graves that cannot hold what they are meant to contain. And in that failure of ritual, in that breakdown of the boundary between life and death, new forms of existence emerge, creatures that belong fully to neither state but draw sustenance from both. The vampire becomes Europe's most persistent monster because it speaks to the continent's deepest fear, that death might not be final, that the suffering and disease and loss that plague brings might continue indefinitely, taking new forms, but never truly ending. It embodies the terror of contagion, made personal, of disease that spreads not just from body to body, but from the dead to the living, creating endless chains of predation and victimization. In the mountain villages of Transylvania, where winter lasts 6 months and summers bring mosquitoes thick as smoke, they know that some hungers outlast the bodies that birth them. That love and need and desperate attachment to life can animate corpses long after the soul should have departed. That the plague leaves behind more than empty houses and mass graves. It creates conditions where death itself becomes infected, transformed into something that feeds rather than ending. As dawn breaks over the troubled villages of plague-haunted Europe, the vampires retreat to their graves and crypts, but they do not rest. Even in the daylight hours, they work at the boundaries of existence, weakening the barriers that separate life from death, making it easier for the next plague, the next mass dying, to create new members of their impossible species. They are patient, these creatures of disease and desperation. They know that plague will come again, that death will always overwhelm life's defenses, that humans will always love too much to let go easily. In the soil of Europe, they wait, undead gardeners tending crops of sorrow, preparing the ground for harvests of blood that will sustain them through the long centuries ahead. As the vampires sink back into their plague-soaked earth, a different kind of monster stirs in the shadows of Prague's Jewish quarter, one born not from hunger or war or disease, but from the desperate need to survive in a world that has declared your very existence an abomination. In the narrow streets where Hebrew prayers mix with Czech curses, where the scent of challah bread mingles with the smoke of burning books, Rabbi Judah Loew ben Bezalel kneels beside the Vltava River and shapes salvation from the clay beneath his fingers. The year is 1580, and the blood libels have come to Prague like locusts, bringing with them the familiar harvest of broken windows and murdered children. The clay is cold and dark, rich with the sediment of centuries. It yields to the rabbi's hands like flesh accepting breath, like nothing becoming something under the pressure of desperate necessity. He shapes it into the form of a man, larger than life, broader than hope, stronger than the hatred that pounds on synagogue doors in the night. This will be his golem, his silent guardian, his answer to the question that has haunted his people since the first stone was thrown. The rabbi speaks the ancient words, the ones passed down from teacher to student in chains unbroken since the temple fell. He writes the sacred letters on parchment and places them beneath the creature's tongue, Aleph, Mem, Tav, Emet, truth, the word that will give it life, purpose, the divine spark that separates creation from mere craft. But this is different from the monsters that have come before. The Wendigo hungers, the werewolf rages, the vampire feeds, all born from humanity's darkest impulses given flesh and purpose. The golem is born from humanity's brightest hope made manifest, the belief that the innocent can be protected, that the weak can find champions, that monsters can serve justice instead of appetite. The clay chest rises and falls with its first breath, and eyes like dark stones open to regard its creator with the patience of mountains. The golem understands its purpose without words: to stand between the vulnerable and those who would harm them, to be the sword arm of a god who sometimes seems to have forgotten how to fight for his chosen people. This is protection made flesh, defense shaped from the very earth that has drunk Jewish blood for centuries. Where other monsters emerge from trauma and suffering, the golem rises from the refusal to accept that suffering is inevitable. It is hope that has learned to fight back. The transformation follows different patterns here, in the maze of Prague's Jewish streets, where survival depends on invisibility and protection must come from within the community itself. There is no slow corruption of the soul, no gradual surrender to bestial impulses. Instead, there is the careful calculation of necessary force, the precise application of divine will to earthly problems. The golem walks through Prague's night like justice delayed but not denied. When the mob gathers outside the synagogue with torches and iron, it appears between them and their intended victims, 8 feet tall, broad as a door, moving with the inexorable purpose of landslide. It does not speak, cannot speak, but its presence speaks louder than any sermon ever preached. The attackers see something in those stone eyes that turns their courage to water. This is not like facing human opposition, where rage can overcome fear and numbers can triumph over strength. This is facing something that cannot be reasoned with, cannot be intimidated, cannot be stopped by anything less than divine intervention. And they begin to understand that if divine intervention has chosen sides, it has not chosen theirs. The golem's violence, when it comes, is precise as surgery and final as judgment. It does not torture or terrorize. These are human refinements that it cannot comprehend. It simply removes threats with the efficiency of a farmer clearing weeds from a garden. A hand placed on a human chest, and ribs crack like kindling. Fingers that close around a throat, and life departs as simply as breath misting in winter air. But there is mercy in its method, a restraint that speaks to its divine origins. The golem kills only when killing is necessary, fights only when fighting is the last resort. It offers warnings first, a step forward, a raised hand, the terrible patience of stone, waiting for wisdom to prevail over hatred. Most often, wisdom does prevail. Most often, the sight of the golem is enough to send the mob dispersing like leaves before wind. In the folklore that grows around these interventions, the golem becomes more than protector. It becomes symbol of Jewish resistance to a world that demands their submission or their death. Stories spread through the quarter of how it saved the baker's daughter from rape, how it prevented the burning of the ceremonial scrolls, how it stood guard over sleeping children while their parents prayed for dawn to break the long night of persecution. These are not the stories that hunger and war and plague inspire, tales of humans transformed into predators, of civilization's failures made manifest in monstrous form. These are stories of power wielded in service of justice, of strength that serves wisdom instead of appetite. The golem represents the possibility that monsters can be more than warnings. They can be weapons in the hands of the righteous. The rabbi controls his creation with the careful precision of a master craftsman tending his finest work. The golem cannot act without direction, cannot think beyond the parameters of its creation, cannot exist independently of the will that shaped it from clay. It is tool rather than creature, instrument rather than being, shaped by divine law to serve divine purpose. But even tools shaped by divine hands can become dangerous when wielded by mortal ones. The rabbi understands this, remembers the stories of other golems in other times, creatures that grew beyond their creator's control, that interpreted their directives too literally or too broadly, that became threats to the very people they were meant to protect. The balance is delicate as spider silk, Too little direction and the golem becomes useless, a statue of clay that gathers dust in forgotten corners. Too much direction, and it begins to develop something like independent thought, something like will of its own. And will, in a creature of such power, becomes a force that mortal hands cannot always guide. In the wider forests of Europe, where Jewish communities represent islands of difference in seas of Christian conformity, other protective spirits stir in response to persecution's pressure. These are older guardians, predating both Christianity and formal Judaism. Ancient powers that recognize injustice and respond with their own brand of intervention. The Leshy of Slavic tradition awakens in the deep woods where refugees flee from burning ghettos. This forest guardian, tall as the trees it protects, becomes ally to those who seek shelter beneath its canopy. It leads lost families to safety, confuses pursuing soldiers with paths that lead nowhere, creates sanctuary in spaces where civilization's hatred cannot reach. Unlike the golem, which serves specific purposes through specific commands, the Leshy acts according to its own ancient understanding of justice. It protects the forest and all who dwell within it peacefully, but it shows no mercy to those who bring violence into its domain. Soldiers who enter the woods with sword and torch often emerge days later, if they emerge at all, speaking in tongues and staring at horizons no human eye should see. In the mountains of Norway and Sweden, where the old gods never quite surrendered to the new ones, the trolls remember their role as guardians of the marginalized. These creatures, massive as boulders and patient as stone, emerge from their cave homes to protect communities that exist outside the protection of kings and churches. Troll bridges become more than folklore. They become actual barriers between the powerful and the powerless, defended by creatures whose strength makes human armies seem like children playing with wooden swords. The trolls demand payment for passage, but the currency they accept is not gold or silver. They require proof of just purpose, evidence of clean conscience, demonstration that the traveler seeks to protect rather than to harm. Those who cannot provide such proof find their journeys ending at the bridge, turned back by guardians who measure worth in scales unknown to human law. Those who pass do so with the knowledge that they travel under protection older and stronger than any earthly authority. In the British Isles, where the black dogs have haunted crossroads and burial grounds since memory began, these spectral guardians take on new significance in times of persecution. No longer merely psychopomps guiding souls between worlds, they become protectors of those whom society has abandoned. The accused witches, the religious dissidents, the travelers who find themselves far from home and safety. The black dog appears to the desperate and the hunted, offering guidance through dangerous terrain, warning of ambushes and betrayals, sometimes fighting alongside those who have no other champions. Its eyes burn like coals in the darkness, and its howl echoes with the voices of all who have died unjustly, all who have fallen to hatred and fear and willful ignorance. These protective monsters serve different communities, but follow similar patterns. They emerge in response to systematic oppression, shaped by the desperate need for defense when no earthly defense exists. They are born from hope rather than despair, from love rather than hatred, from the refusal to accept that might always makes right. But they are monsters nonetheless, creatures that exist outside the normal boundaries of life and law. Their protection comes at a cost. The knowledge that safety depends on powers beyond human understanding, that justice sometimes requires intervention by forces that care nothing for human sensibilities about right and wrong. The Golem's protection transforms the Jewish quarter of Prague from a place of vulnerable isolation into something approaching fortress. The rabbi's creation patrols the narrow streets with the diligence of a professional soldier and the devotion of a loving parent. Children who once huddled in cellars during riots now play in courtyards, knowing that their guardian watches from the shadows. But the transformation extends beyond simple physical protection. the golem's presence changes how the community sees itself, no longer merely victims waiting for salvation, but people capable of defending themselves, of creating their own salvation from clay and prayer and desperate necessity. The creature becomes symbol as much as guardian, proof that the powerless need not remain powerless forever. The Prague Golem grows famous throughout Central Europe, its story spreading like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Jewish communities from Vienna to Warsaw whisper of the creature that protects their people, of the rabbi who dared to speak creation into clay. Some attempt to recreate the miracle, following half-remembered instructions and improvised rituals. Most fail. Creating life from earth requires more than knowledge or technique. It demands the kind of desperate love that sees no boundary between impossible and necessary. The faith that believes protection is not just desired, but deserved. It requires a creator willing to take responsibility for a weapon that might one day need to be turned against its own maker. In the small hours before dawn, when Prague sleeps under the golem's watchful gaze, Rabbi Lowe sometimes questions the wisdom of his creation. He watches his clay guardian standing motionless in the synagogue's courtyard, waiting for dawn to reveal new threats or new tasks, and wonders what he has truly accomplished. Has he created protection or merely postponed persecution? Has he solved the problem of Jewish vulnerability or simply transformed it into a different kind of dependence? The golem can guard against mobs and murderers, but it cannot change the hearts that harbor hatred, cannot address the root causes that make such protection necessary. These are the questions that haunt creators of protective monsters, whether they have truly improved their people's situation or merely escalated the conflict to a level where the stakes grow ever higher. The golem's strength is finite, its existence dependent on rituals that can be forgotten or corrupted. What happens when the rabbi dies and takes his knowledge with him? What happens when the community becomes too dependent on supernatural protection to remember how to protect itself? The clay from which the golem was shaped came from the banks of the Vltava, where the river runs dark and deep through the heart of Prague. But clay is temporary material, shaped by hands that will not always be steady, sustained by words that will not always be remembered correctly. Even the most powerful protection has limits. Even the most devoted guardian can be unmade by the same forces that brought it into being. In the end, the golem serves as both promise and warning, proof that monsters can serve justice, but reminder that justice served by monsters is justice dependent on forces beyond human control. It stands guard over Prague's Jewish quarter-like hope made manifest, protecting the present while raising questions about the future that no amount of clay and prayer can fully answer. The protective monsters multiply across Europe wherever persecution creates the need for supernatural intervention. They emerge from the desperation of communities that have exhausted all earthly options, shaped by love, and defended by powers that exist outside the normal rules of engagement. They offer hope to the hopeless and strength to the weak, but they also serve as reminders that in a world where monsters are necessary for protection, something fundamental has gone wrong with the natural order. As night falls over the cobblestones of Prague, the golem takes its position at the heart of the quarter, stone eyes watching, clay hands ready to shapeshift from tools of creation to instruments of destruction as circumstances require. It stands patient as the earth from which it was made, enduring as the faith that shaped it, ready to remind the world that not all monsters serve darkness. Some serve the light, and some serve the desperate hope that light will prove stronger than the gathering dark. As the protective spirits retreat to their ancient hiding places, a new kind of monster stalks through Europe, one that wears the robes of righteousness and speaks with the authority of heaven itself. In the Cathedral of Tours, where the council convenes in the year 813, Archbishop Theodulf raises his staff above the assembled clergy and pronounces judgment on the old ways. His voice echoes through the stone arches with the weight of divine command, transforming folklore into heresy with the simple expedient of official condemnation. The spirits that once protected village children become demons that steal them. The guardians that once blessed harvests become devils that curse them. With words spoken in Latin and sanctified by holy oil, the Church begins the great work of remaking Europe's monsters in its own image. Brother Marcus, scribe to the Archbishop, dips his quill in ink black as midnight and begins the careful work of documentation. He writes down the old names: Krampus, the horned guardian of alpine winters; the fauns that blessed fertility and protected livestock; the woodland spirits that guided lost travelers to safety. But as the ink dries on the parchment, these beings undergo a transformation more complete than any werewolf ever achieved. They become demons, devils, servants of Satan sent to tempt good Christians from the path of righteousness. The transformation is as methodical as it is devastating. Each spirit, each guardian, each protective force that preceded Christianity's arrival finds itself redefined according to a new theology of absolute moral division. There can be no neutral spirits in this cosmology, no beings that exist outside the eternal war between good and evil. Everything that is not explicitly Christian becomes explicitly demonic by default. In the Alps, where winter nights stretch longer than human endurance and children disappear into snowdrifts like stones dropped into deep water, Krampus has walked beside St. Nicholas for centuries beyond counting. The horned figure serves as winter's necessary balance. While the saint rewards good children with gifts, Krampus reminds the wicked that choices have consequences, that kindness is precious because cruelty is always possible. But the priests who arrive with crosses and holy water see only the horns, only the fearsome visage that speaks of older powers than those sanctioned by Rome. They cannot comprehend a moral universe where protection and punishment might emerge from the same source, where love might express itself through fear as well as comfort. In their theology, such complexity is impossible. There is only God's love and Satan's hatred, heaven's light and hell's darkness. Krampus becomes a devil almost overnight. The chains he carries, once symbols of his power to bind evil and protect the innocent, become evidence of his servitude to darker masters. His horns, which once marked him as a creature of the wild places where divine power runs free and undomesticated, become proof of his demonic nature. The fear he inspires, which once served to reinforce moral boundaries and protect community standards, becomes simple malevolence seeking to corrupt and destroy. The children who once understood that Krampus loved them enough to frighten them straight now learn to see him as their enemy. The parents who once invoked his name to encourage good behavior now speak it only in whispers, as if calling upon forbidden knowledge. The complex moral ecosystem that balanced reward and consequence, protection and punishment, dissolves into simple opposition between Christian and demonic, acceptable and forbidden. In the forests of Gaul, where the fauns have blessed fertility rites since before Rome was founded, the transformation follows similar patterns. These creatures of horn and hoof and overflowing life force become symbols not of natural abundance, but of unnatural lust. Their connection to fertility rituals, once celebrated as divine gift, becomes evidence of their corrupting influence. Their wild joy in physical existence becomes proof of their opposition to spiritual purity. Father Guillaume, recently appointed to minister to the Breton countryside, arrives with holy water and sacred oil to cleanse the land of its ancient protectors. He finds shrines where couples have come for generations to ask the faun's blessing on their marriages, their crops, their hopes for children. The offerings left there, flowers and bread, wine and honey, speak of communities that see the divine as present in the physical world, immanent in the very substances of life. But Guillaume sees only paganism, only the worship of false gods that must be rooted out like weeds from a garden. He consecrates the shrines to Christian saints, replaces the horned figures with crucifixes, transforms places of celebration into spaces of penitence. The fauns, stripped of their role as fertility blessings, become demons of sexual temptation. Their gift for inspiring love becomes power to corrupt it. The village women who once brought their wedding veils to be blessed by these spirits now confess the practice as sin. The young men who danced with fauns at harvest festivals now kneel in penance for consorting with devils. The complex understanding of sexuality as divine gift, intertwined with human responsibility, collapses into simple condemnation of flesh and exaltation of spirit. This process repeats across the continent with the thoroughness of plague. In the Germanic forests, the woodland spirits that guide lost children home become demons that lead them astray. In Celtic territories, the shapeshifters that teach wisdom through transformation become devils that corrupt human form. In Slavic lands, the household spirits that protect families become demons that infiltrate and destroy them. The Church's method is brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to erase the old beliefs entirely, an impossible task given their deep roots in popular consciousness, it recontextualizes them within Christian framework. The spirits and monsters that people know and fear and sometimes love become proof of Christianity's truth. They exist, yes, but they exist as enemies of God rather than as independent powers with their own moral complexity. Brother Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologica will reshape Christian understanding for centuries, provides the theological framework for this transformation. In his systematic analysis of spiritual reality, there can be no neutral ground between heaven and hell. Every supernatural being must be classified as either angel or demon, servant of God, or soldier of Satan. The rich spectrum of spiritual entities that European folklore recognizes, protective spirits, trickster figures, nature guardians, ancestral ghosts, gets compressed into simple binary opposition. The intellectual elegance of this system appeals to minds trained in Aristotelian logic, but its practical implementation requires the systematic destruction of cultural memory. Stories must be rewritten, festivals must be recontextualized, traditional practices must be redefined as either Christian or satanic. The middle ground where most human experience actually occurs, the space between absolute good and absolute evil, where moral choices are complex and consequences are ambiguous, disappears from official recognition. In the mountain villages of Bavaria, where Krampusnacht has been celebrated since before the Romans came, the transformation creates profound spiritual dissonance. The people know in their bones that Krampus serves justice, not evil. They have seen how his fearsome presence keeps children safe and communities strong. They understand that his punishment serves love's purpose, that his chains bind evil rather than enabling it. But the priests speak with the authority of Rome, and Rome speaks with the authority of God. To resist their redefinition of beloved traditions becomes not just social rebellion, but spiritual heresy. The people face an impossible choice: abandon beliefs that have served their communities for centuries, or risk eternal damnation by clinging to practices now defined as demonic. Many choose a middle path that satisfies neither tradition nor orthodoxy. They maintain the old festivals, but frame them in Christian terms. Krampus becomes a symbol of hell's punishment rather than winter's justice. The fauns become cautionary examples of Satan's temptation rather than celebrants of divine fertility. The protective spirits become evidence of demons' deception rather than manifestation of divine care. This compromise preserves the forms while destroying the meaning. The festivals continue, but their spiritual significance inverts. Where once they celebrated complex moral realities, they now reinforce simple moral divisions. Where once they acknowledged the divine presence in wild and dangerous forms, they now confirm that wildness and danger can only be demonic. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, represents the culmination of this process. This manual for identifying and prosecuting witches systematically demonizes every form of folk practice that exists outside church authority. Herbalism becomes poisoning, midwifery becomes infanticide, weatherworking becomes diabolic pact-making. The wise women who once served as intermediaries between human community and spiritual world become Satan's agents sent to corrupt and destroy. Under the Malleus's influence, the monsters of European folklore undergo their final transformation. They become not explanations for human experience, but evidence of human corruption. The vampire is no longer a warning about what happens when death refuses to be final. It becomes proof that some humans serve Satan so completely that they continue his work even after death. The werewolf is no longer a metaphor for what war does to human souls. It becomes evidence that some people voluntarily surrender their humanity to demonic influence. Most tragically, the protective spirits that communities created to defend the vulnerable become evidence of those communities' corruption. The Golem is not proof that the powerless can create their own champions. It becomes demonstration that Jews practice forbidden magic. The Leshy is not evidence that the forest itself protects those who seek shelter there. It becomes proof that pagan practices lead to diabolic alliance. In the witch trials that sweep across Europe like recurring plague, the systematic demonization of folklore becomes legal doctrine. Women who know the old healing songs face execution for practicing maleficium. Men who understand the proper offerings for household spirits burn as practitioners of devil worship. Children who have learned to leave bread for the local sprites are tortured until they confess to attending witches' sabbaths. The Sabbath itself represents the ultimate inversion of folk tradition, where communities once gathered to celebrate the turning of seasons and the blessing of harvests. The Inquisitors imagined gatherings dedicated to Satan's worship. Where people once danced with spirits of place and season, the witch hunters envision orgies of diabolic corruption. Where folk practice sought harmony between human need and spiritual power, the Church sees only rebellion against divine authority. Margaret Barclay of Irvine, Scotland, faces the Kirk session in 1618 accused of practicing witchcraft by attending to women in childbirth with herbs and prayers that predate Christianity by centuries. The knowledge that her grandmother passed down, which plants ease labor pain, which words help women find strength in their bodies' ancient wisdom, becomes evidence of diabolic pact. Her success in bringing healthy babies into the world proves not her skill, but Satan's temporary favor. Under torture, she confesses to meeting with the devil at midnight crossroads, to receiving supernatural powers in exchange for her soul, to using those powers to harm rather than heal. The confession bears no resemblance to her actual practice, but it fits perfectly with the theological framework that requires all non-Christian spiritual activity to be diabolic in origin. Her execution serves as warning to other women who carry traditional knowledge. The message is clear. There is no neutral ground between Christ and Satan, no independent source of healing power, no legitimate spiritual authority outside the Church. The wise women who once served as bridges between human community and spiritual reality must choose between abandoning their calling or being branded as enemies of God. The psychological cost of this transformation extends far beyond the individual victims of persecution. Entire communities lose access to spiritual resources that have sustained them for centuries. The complex moral ecology that folklore provided, where protection and danger, good and evil, sacred and profane interpenetrated in recognition of life's actual complexity, gets replaced by rigid categories that bear little resemblance to lived experience. Children who once learned through monster stories that the world contains both wonder and danger, that moral choices have real consequences, that protection requires vigilance and courage, now learn only that everything outside Christian orthodoxy is dangerous, that moral choice is simple opposition between good and evil, that protection comes only through submission to ecclesiastical authority. The monsters themselves become internally contradictory under this new dispensation. They must be powerful enough to serve as credible threats justifying church authority, but powerless enough that church methods can defeat them. They must be real enough that people take the danger seriously, but unreal enough that they can be dismissed whenever convenient. They must be terrifying enough to motivate obedience, but comprehensible enough to fit within theological categories. This contradiction creates monsters that serve institutional needs rather than psychological ones. The vampire becomes not a complex exploration of what happens when death refuses its boundaries, but a simple example of what happens to those who reject Christian burial rites. The werewolf becomes not a nuanced examination of what war does to human identity, but straightforward proof that some people choose to serve Satan. The protective spirits become not recognition that communities can create their own defenses, but evidence that such attempts inevitably lead to corruption. In the villages of Transylvania, where vampire beliefs run deeper than groundwater, the church's recontextualization creates particularly painful dissonance. The people know from experience that proper burial rites and consecrated ground provide protection against the restless dead. But they also know that these protections sometimes fail, that human love and desperation can overcome even the strongest spiritual barriers. The traditional response to such failures involved community action, digging up graves, driving stakes through hearts, burning bodies that showed signs of unnatural preservation. These practices emerged from local wisdom about how to maintain the boundary between life and death, how to help troubled souls find peace, how to protect the living from the dead's hunger. But the church reframes these practices as either unnecessary, if you truly trust in Christ's protection, or diabolic, if you rely on methods not sanctioned by ecclesiastical authority. The people find themselves caught between their own experience and official doctrine, between what they know works and what they are told should work. Many choose to maintain the old practices in secret, creating a shadow folklore that preserves traditional wisdom while paying lip service to official theology. Others abandon the practices entirely and hope that Christian rites alone will prove sufficient. A few attempt to synthesize the approaches, seeking church blessing for traditional methods or Christian explanations for folk practices. None of these solutions proves entirely satisfactory. The secret practitioners live in constant fear of discovery and persecution. Those who abandon tradition find themselves defenseless when Christian rites fail to address problems that require traditional solutions. Those who attempt synthesis create theological contradictions that satisfy neither folk wisdom nor ecclesiastical orthodoxy. The long-term effect is the gradual impoverishment of European spiritual life. The rich ecosystem of folk belief, with its complex moral reasoning, its recognition of spiritual forces beyond human control, its practical wisdom about living in a world where good and evil interpenetrate, gives way to simplified opposition between Christian and demonic, orthodox and heretical, saved and damned. The monsters that once served as teachers and protectors, warnings and guides, become either demons to be exorcised or fantasies to be dismissed. Their psychological function, helping communities process trauma, maintain moral boundaries, and create meaning from suffering, transfers to the church, which proves less capable of providing the nuanced understanding that folklore offered. In the cold hours before dawn, when the last witch has been burned and the last protective spirit has been officially declared demonic, Europe finds itself fundamentally changed. The monsters remain, but they serve new masters now. They speak not the complex truths of human experience, but the simplified demands of institutional authority. They no longer help communities understand themselves, but instead teach them to distrust their own wisdom and depend on external validation. The great work of remaking Europe's monsters is complete, but the victory proves hollow. In destroying the old meanings, the Church has also destroyed much of the old wisdom. In simplifying the moral universe, it has made that universe less capable of addressing the actual complexity of human existence. In conquering the monsters, it has also conquered much of what made them valuable. The shadows lengthen across the European landscape, and in those shadows, something essential has been lost. The understanding that monsters can serve truth as well as power, that fear can teach as well as control, that the spiritual world contains more mysteries than any single institution can hope to contain or understand. As the institutional shadows recede into history's darker corners, something ancient stirs beneath the soil of modern Europe, something that never truly died, never fully surrendered, never completely believed in its own obsolescence. The shovel bites into frozen earth outside Veliko Gradište, Serbia, in the winter of 2004, and the sound it makes is like a sigh escaping from the world's lungs. Miroslav Milosevic wipes sweat from his forehead despite the bitter cold and continues digging. His neighbor, Petra Toma, has been dead for 3 days, but death, it seems, has not been sufficient to keep him in his grave. The reports came first from Petra's widow, waking to find her husband's shape pressed into the mattress beside her, cold flesh against warm, familiar hands that no longer carried the weight of life. Then from his brother, who swore he saw Petra walking the village streets at midnight, moving with the patient purpose of someone who has all eternity to reach his destination. Finally, from the children, who spoke of dreams where dead Petra visited their bedrooms and whispered stories about the grey place where the dead wait for the living to join them. Miroslav knows what these signs mean, has known since childhood when his grandmother taught him the old words in whispered Serbian that carried the weight of centuries. The dead do not always rest easy, especially when they die carrying too much unfinished business, too much love for the world they have left behind. Sometimes they need help remembering how to stay dead. He finds what he expects to find 6 feet down in the winter earth, a body that shows no signs of decay, skin still pink with the bloom of impossible life, fresh blood pooling around the mouth like evidence of recent feeding. The sight fills him with a terror that has nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with inherited knowledge. Genetic memory of what happens when death refuses to accept its boundaries. The wooden stake goes through Petra's heart with less resistance than Miroslav expects, as if the flesh were eager to accept this final punctuation mark. Blood wells up around the point. Too much blood for a dead man. Too red for something that should have been grey with death's touch. The corpse makes a sound like steam escaping from a kettle, and something essential seems to deflate, to finally accept the ending it has been avoiding. They burn the heart separately, following protocols that predate Christianity by centuries, scattering the ashes in running water where they cannot reform, cannot recombine into something that might remember what it used to be. The ritual feels both ancient and immediate, both primitive and necessary, a recognition that some truths transcend the boundaries of rationality and historical period. This is how the monsters of Europe survive into the modern age. Not as folklore or entertainment, not as academic curiosities or tourist attractions, but as practical responses to problems that persist despite the Enlightenment's promises. In the villages where tradition runs deeper than plumbing, where memory stretches back further than written records, the old knowledge endures because the old needs endure. In the mountains of rural Poland, where winter lasts 8 months and the nearest hospital might as well be on the moon, Maria Kowalski still leaves bread and milk for the household spirits that keep her family safe. She has done this every night for 60 years, learned the practice from her mother, who learned it from her grandmother, in an unbroken chain that stretches back to times when the distinction between Christian and pagan was less important than the distinction between protected and vulnerable. The ritual is simple enough. A crust of bread on the windowsill, a saucer of fresh milk by the hearth, quiet words spoken in Polish that carry older rhythms, older meanings. To her children, who live in Warsaw and visit twice a year, this looks like harmless eccentricity, the kind of rural superstition that education and urbanization will eventually eliminate. But Maria knows better. She remembers the winter when she forgot the offering, when the bread stayed in the cupboard and the milk remained in the pitcher, when the household spirit that had protected her family for generations withdrew its attention and left them exposed to malevolent influences. That was the winter her youngest son nearly died of pneumonia, when the pipes froze and burst, when the roof collapsed under snow that should have been manageable. She never forgot again. And in the decades since, her family has prospered in the quiet ways that matter: healthy children, adequate harvests, protection from the kinds of random disasters that devastate less careful households. The correlation might be coincidence, but Maria has lived too long and seen too much to believe in coincidence when older explanations prove more reliable. The practice spreads through her village like underground water, passed from grandmother to granddaughter in whispered instructions that never appear in official documents. The local priest, educated in seminary and trained in rational theology, officially disapproves but unofficially understands. He has seen too many unexplained recoveries, too many unlikely protections, too many instances where folk wisdom succeeds where modern methods fail. In the Carpathian Mountains of Romania, where Vlad the Impaler once ruled and vampires supposedly originated, the old protections persist with the tenacity of weeds growing through concrete. Dr. Elena Popescu, trained in Bucharest and committed to scientific medicine, arrives in the mountain village of Brasov to establish a modern clinic and finds herself confronting medical mysteries that her education never prepared her to address. Children arrive at her clinic with symptoms that make no sense according to established pathology: wasting diseases that respond to no known treatment, behavioral changes that follow no recognized pattern, injuries that heal in ways that seem to defy biological law. When she prescribes modern pharmaceuticals, her patients improve temporarily, but relapse as soon as the medication is discontinued. When she refers them to specialists in the capital, the symptoms mysteriously disappear during examination, only to return worse than before. The local healers, old women who learned their craft from older women in lineages that stretch back beyond written memory, offer different diagnoses. They speak of spiritual contamination, of protective boundaries that have been breached, of ancient hungers that have found new ways to feed. Their treatments involve herbs that Dr. Popescu recognizes from her pharmacology texts, mixed with rituals that she learned to dismiss in medical school. But the treatments work where hers fail. The children recover under the care of healers who understand illness as more than merely physical malfunction, who recognize that some diseases originate in the spaces between body and spirit, between individual and community, between the needs of the living and the hungers of the dead. Dr. Popescu finds herself caught between her scientific training and her clinical observations, between what she was taught to believe and what she sees working in practice. Gradually, carefully, she begins to incorporate folk wisdom into her medical practice, not abandoning modern medicine but recognizing its limitations, understanding that healing sometimes requires approaches that exist outside the boundaries of rational materialism. The accommodation proves more successful than either traditional or modern methods alone. Patients receive both pharmaceutical treatment and ritual protection, both clinical diagnosis and spiritual cleansing. The village begins to trust the doctor, who respects their wisdom while offering her own. And Dr. Popescu discovers that healing involves more than simply treating symptoms. It requires understanding the complex ecology of factors that influence human health and well-being. In the Balkans, where the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s awakened memories that had slept for generations, the old protections resurface with frightening relevance. As villages burn and families flee, as neighbors turn against neighbors, and ancient hatreds bloom like poisonous flowers, people rediscover the need for defenses that exist outside the realm of conventional politics and military strategy. Anna Markovich, a refugee from Srebrenica, who has seen her world collapse into genocidal nightmare, carries with her more than just material possessions. Hidden in the folds of her coat, sewn into the lining of her children's clothing, pressed between the pages of family photographs, she carries the protective amulets and written charms that her grandmother taught her to prepare for times when human law fails and only older powers offer hope of survival. The iron nails driven through pieces of blessed wood, the bags of salt mixed with cemetery earth, the prayers written in alphabets that predate Latin script. These objects look like primitive superstition to relief workers trained in modern humanitarian principles. But Anna knows their value from lived experience, has seen how they create invisible barriers between her family and the malevolent influences that war unleashes, how they provide protection that no United Nations peacekeeping force can offer. During the siege, when snipers made movement dangerous and artillery made nowhere safe, Anna's family survived in ways that seemed miraculous to outside observers. They found water when wells ran dry, located food when supplies were cut off, avoided detection when other families were discovered and destroyed. The correlation between their survival and Anna's careful maintenance of protective rituals might be dismissed as survivor bias, but Anna herself knows better. She has seen what happens to those who abandon the old ways, who trust entirely in modern solutions to problems that have ancient roots. They become vulnerable in ways that tactical planning cannot address, exposed to influences that military strategy cannot comprehend. They fall victim not just to human violence, but to the spiritual contamination that warfare spreads. The psychic toxins that conflict releases into communities like poison gas that affects souls instead of lungs. The protective practices evolve to address contemporary threats while maintaining their essential function. Computer passwords incorporate protective formulas. Apartment buildings receive ritual blessings. Modern vehicles carry amulets designed to guard against accidents that might be more than merely random. The old wisdom adapts to new circumstances without losing its fundamental recognition that human beings need protection from forces that exist beyond the reach of conventional understanding. In the suburbs of Prague, where Rabbi Loew once shaped the famous Golem from Vltava River clay, Sarah Abramovitz maintains traditions that connect her to that legendary creation. She is a software engineer by training, a rationalist by education, a skeptic by inclination. But she is also a Jewish woman living in a city where anti-Semitism never entirely disappeared, where recent history demonstrates how quickly civilization can collapse into barbarism. In her apartment, overlooking the Jewish quarter, she performs rituals that would be familiar to the rabbi who died 4 centuries ago. Not the creation of a golem, that knowledge was lost or deliberately hidden, but the smaller protections, the daily observances that create spiritual barriers around vulnerable communities. The mezuzah on her doorpost, the Shabbat candles that burn in her window, the Hebrew prayers that she speaks over food and wine. These practices connect her to a tradition of spiritual self-defense that has sustained Jewish communities through centuries of persecution. The protection extends beyond the purely personal. Through her work with local Jewish organizations, Sarah helps maintain communal rituals that serve the same function as individual observances, creating bonds of mutual protection, reinforcing collective identity, establishing spiritual barriers that help the community resist both external threats and internal dissolution. When anti-Semitic graffiti appears on synagogue walls, when nationalist politicians make coded appeals to ancient prejudices, when economic hardship creates the conditions where scapegoating becomes tempting, the community responds not just with political activism and legal action, but with intensified observance of protective traditions that have proven their worth across generations of testing. The archaeological record of modern Europe reveals how extensively these practices persist despite official disapproval and academic dismissal. Excavations in rural cemeteries continue to uncover burials that show clear evidence of vampire precautions. Skulls weighted with stones, rib cages filled with garlic and holy symbols, corpses positioned in ways designed to prevent them from rising. These discoveries span centuries, from medieval plague graves to burials from the 20th century, demonstrating the remarkable persistence of beliefs that rational materialism declared obsolete long ago. The archaeologists who make these discoveries often struggle to interpret them, trained as they are in scientific methodologies that have difficulty accommodating evidence of persistent irrationality. But the evidence speaks for itself. As recently as the 1970s, in villages throughout Eastern Europe, communities continued to take practical action against the threat of vampiric revenants. They drove stakes through hearts, filled mouths with garlic, positioned bodies to prevent them from turning over in their graves. These were not theatrical gestures or historical reenactments, but serious attempts to address genuine concerns about the possibility that death might not prove final for everyone. Professor Wilhelm Henkel, an archaeologist working in the Carpathian region, discovers a pattern that challenges his preconceptions about the relationship between education and superstition. The vampire precautions in modern burials are not random or primitive, but demonstrate sophisticated understanding of both traditional law and contemporary circumstances. The communities that practice these rituals do so selectively, applying them in cases where they judge the risk of vampiric return to be particularly high. The judgments follow criteria that seem logical within their own framework. Individuals who died violently, unexpectedly, or under emotionally charged circumstances receive special attention. Those who died while carrying heavy burdens of guilt, unfulfilled love, or unfinished responsibility are considered especially likely to resist death's finality. Bodies that show unusual preservation or other anomalous characteristics trigger community action designed to prevent supernatural complications. The sophistication of these judgments suggests that the communities in question are not simply preserving ancient superstitions, but actively applying traditional wisdom to contemporary situations. They distinguish between ordinary death, which requires only conventional burial rites, and problematic death, which demands additional precautions. Their diagnostic criteria demonstrate deep understanding of the psychological and spiritual factors that traditional law identifies as contributing to vampiric transformation. In the village of Medveja, Serbia, where the original Petar Blagojevic case occurred centuries earlier, similar situations continue to arise with disturbing regularity. Local historian Marko Jovanovic documents cases from the late 20th century where communities took collective action against suspected vampires, following protocols that have changed little since the 18th century. The most recent case occurred in 2003, when villagers disinterred and burned the body of Mirko Tomic, a local man whose death from heart attack was followed by reports of supernatural visitation. The action was taken not by isolated individuals, but by community consensus, with broad participation from villagers who included school teachers, shopkeepers, and other educated residents. The participants understood that their actions would be dismissed as primitive superstition by outside observers, but they also understood that outside observers had not experienced the phenomena that prompted their response. They had lived through the weeks following Tomic's death, when unexplained illnesses swept through the village, when electrical systems failed without cause, when domestic animals exhibited behavior that suggested the presence of malevolent influences. Their solution was practical rather than symbolic. They removed Tomic's body from its grave, confirmed that it showed signs of vampiric preservation, and destroyed it according to traditional methods. The phenomena that had troubled the village ceased immediately, and normal life resumed with a completeness that suggested more than mere coincidence. The case received brief mention in regional newspapers, framed as an example of rural backwardness persisting in an era of supposed enlightenment. But for the villagers involved, the successful resolution of a practical problem using traditional methods demonstrated the continued relevance of knowledge that formal education had taught them to dismiss. In the forests of northern Finland, where the aurora borealis paints the winter sky in colours that have no names in southern languages, Elsa Päiväläinen maintains relationships with spirits that predate both Christianity and the modern Finnish state. She is a social worker by profession, a university graduate by education, a rational materialist by official philosophy, but she is also a daughter of the forest, raised by grandparents who taught her to recognize the presence of powers that exist outside human understanding. Her work takes her to remote communities where traditional Sami culture intersects with modern social services, where the needs of contemporary families must be addressed through methods that respect ancient wisdom. She finds herself mediating between worldviews, translating between official social work protocols and traditional healing practices, helping families navigate systems that often seem designed to ignore the spiritual dimensions of human problems. The protective spirits of the northern forests, entities that Western anthropology categorizes as shamanic beliefs, but which Elsa experiences as active presences, offer guidance that proves more effective than conventional therapeutic approaches. They provide insight into family dynamics that official training overlooks, suggest interventions that address root causes rather than surface symptoms, offer healing methods that integrate individual welfare with community well-being. Elsa's success rate exceeds that of colleagues who rely exclusively on conventional methods, but she cannot document her actual practices in official reports without risking professional censure. She learns to translate between languages, to describe spiritual interventions in secular terminology, to protect traditional knowledge while making it accessible to families who need it. The accommodation requires constant vigilance and careful balance. She must appear sufficiently conventional to satisfy bureaucratic requirements while remaining sufficiently traditional to maintain her effectiveness. She must respect both scientific training and indigenous wisdom without allowing either to completely dominate her practice. As winter settles over the European landscape like a familiar weight, the last practitioners of ancient wisdom continue their quiet work. In villages and cities, in apartments and farmhouses, in places where tradition has learned to hide beneath the surface of modernity, they maintain connections that official culture declares obsolete, but which practical experience proves essential. They are the inheritors of knowledge that stretches back to humanity's earliest attempts to understand the relationship between visible and invisible worlds, between human needs and non-human powers, between the requirements of survival and the demands of meaning. They preserve methods that have proven their worth across generations of testing, that have survived persecution and dismissal, that continue to provide protection and healing when conventional approaches prove insufficient. The monsters of Europe have not disappeared. They have simply learned to hide better, to adapt to contemporary circumstances, to work through methods that escape official notice. They persist in the spaces between rational explanation and lived experience, in the gaps between what education teaches and what life demands, in the silence that surrounds practices too important to risk exposing to institutional disapproval. In the soil of Europe, they wait, patient as the earth itself, enduring as the human need for protection against forces that exceed human control, ready to remind each generation that the mysteries they represent are not solved by dismissal, but only by understanding. They are the echoes that sound in the spaces between heartbeats, the shadows that move in peripheral vision, the knowledge that whispers its name when the familiar world grows too small to contain the complexity of actual existence. The last monsters of a dying Europe are not dying at all. They are simply learning new forms of camouflage, new methods of persistence, new ways of serving the human communities that created them from need and fear and desperate love. In the forgotten corners where tradition survives, in the hidden practices where wisdom endures, in the quiet moments when ordinary people reach for protections older than memory, They continue their ancient work of standing guard at the boundaries between known and unknown, safe and dangerous, human and other. The soil remembers what the surface forgets. The earth holds what the air releases. And somewhere beneath the feet of those who walk too quickly toward futures that promise more than they can deliver, the ancient guardians wait with the patience of stones and the memory of mountains, ready to remind the world that some truths cannot be buried, some knowledge cannot be lost, some protections cannot be abandoned without consequences that echo through generations like thunder rolling across an endless sky.